Avoidants don't chase confidence, they chase relief. Avoidants are not scanning the room for the loudest presence, the most self-assured posture, or the person who performs independence like a badge. What they're actually attuned to is pressure, and more specifically, who removes it. Confidence doesn't impress them if it feels like a demand. Independence doesn't attract them if it comes with emotional noise. What lands quietly and deeply is relief, the felt sense that they can exist next to someone without being corrected, coached, pulled closer, or emotionally evaluated. Relief is rare for an avoidant, and rarity is what registers as value. They are not drawn to certainty when certainty feels like control. They've spent much of their emotional life being managed by expectations, by unspoken rules, by people who needed reassurance to feel secure. So when someone shows up calm, grounded, and internally regulated, it disarms them. Not because it's impressive, but because it's unfamiliar. A high value presence doesn't ask, "Are you okay now?" every time the energy shifts. It doesn't monitor distance. It doesn't require emotional performance to stay connected. That absence of management creates space, and space is where avoidance finally breathes. To an avoidant, emotional pressure doesn't always look dramatic. Often it looks like just checking in, just wanting clarity, or just wanting to talk things through. But their nervous system reads all of it the same way as surveillance. High-value partners don't unknowingly activate that alarm. They don't try to secure closeness by tightening their grip. They allow connection to exist without constant proof. And that allowance feels like relief in a body that's used to bracing. This is why avoidants are often drawn to people who seem almost deceptively simple, not emotionally flat, but emotionally clean. Someone whose presence doesn't ask them to show up a certain way. Someone who isn't tracking their availability like a metric. Someone who doesn't turn intimacy into a test. High value in this context is not about how much you offer. It's about how little pressure you bring into the room. Your steadiness becomes the invitation. Relief also comes from predictability, without demand. The high value partner is consistent, but not insistent, available, but not intrusive. They don't confuse access with entitlement. They don't interpret every pause as a problem to solve. This kind of energy allows avoidants to stay present longer than they usually can, because they're not defending their autonomy at every turn. What most people miss is this: avoidants don't move toward what feels good in the moment. They move toward what feels safe in their body. And safety, for them, begins where emotional pressure ends. That's why they may not praise this quality. They may not even consciously recognize it, but they feel it and they orient toward it. So when an avoidant calls someone different or says, "It just feels easy with you," this is what they mean: not excitement, not intensity, relief. And in their world, relief is the highest form of attraction there is. They don't want someone distant. They want someone complete. Avoidants are often misunderstood as people who only want space, detachment, or emotional distance. That's not accurate. What they recoil from isn't closeness, it's enmeshment. It's the feeling that another person's emotional stability depends on their availability. A high-value partner doesn't create that pressure. They are self-contained, not closed off, not unreachable, just internally. Self-containment means your emotional state doesn't leak into the room unchecked. You don't arrive carrying unprocessed anxiety, hoping someone else will absorb it for you. You don't need constant reassurance to stay regulated. You can feel uncertainty without outsourcing it. For an avoidant, this is profoundly disarming. They're used to being the stabilizer, the regulator, the one who has to manage someone else's emotional weather. When they encounter someone who manages their own inner world, it immediately registers as safety. This is where people get it wrong. They think pulling back, acting aloof, or minimizing feelings will make them more attractive to an avoidant. But detachment feels just as unsafe as neediness, just in a different way. Detachment signals emotional unavailability. Self-containment signals emotional maturity. The difference is subtle, but avoidants feel it instantly. One creates distance, the other creates trust. A self-contained partner can be close without gripping. They can care without collapsing. They can express desire without attaching their worth to the outcome. That's what makes them high value. They don't make intimacy feel like a contract you accidentally signed. There's no unspoken clause that says, if you pull back, I fall apart. Instead, there's a quiet understanding. Connection is chosen, not enforced. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to emotional obligation. When they sense that someone needs them to stay regulated, to feel okay, or to feel secure, their nervous system goes into retreat. A self-contained partner removes that threat. They show through behavior that closeness is an addition to an already full life, not a lifeline. That distinction changes everything. This kind of presence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It's felt in how someone responds to uncertainty, to pauses, to moments of distance. They don't rush to fix the feeling. They don't escalate emotion to regain connection. They stay grounded, and that groundedness invites the avoidant forward in a way pursuit never could. This is an emotional absence. There is warmth here. There is availability. There is care, but it's clean. It's owned. It doesn't spill over and ask to be carried. Emotional self-ownership tells the avoidant, you are welcome here, but you are not responsible for me. And for someone who has spent a lifetime equating closeness with burden, that message is magnetic. In the end, avoidants don't fall for distance, they fall for completeness. For someone who can stand on their own feet and still choose connection, not out of fear, but out of desire, what scares them isn't honesty. It's pursuit disguised as honesty. Avoidants are often accused of being afraid of feelings, but that's not the real threat. What unsettles them is emotional intensity that keeps coming back for confirmation, validation, or resolution. They don't fear truth, they fear being cornered by it. Many people believe that if they just explain themselves more clearly, more vulnerably, or more thoroughly, the avoidant will finally feel safe enough to stay. But repetition doesn't create safety for an avoidant. It creates pressure. High-value partners understand this distinction. They know how to express emotion once, cleanly, calmly, and without attachment to the outcome. There's no emotional looping, no follow-up speeches, no subtle attempts to steer the other person into agreement. They don't revisit the same conversation under different emotional disguises. And because of that, their words carry weight. Not because they're persuasive, but because they're final. Avoidants respect this kind of clarity more than they ever admit. When someone says, this is how I feel, this is what I want, and then stops, it signals emotional strength. It tells the avoidant they are not being recruited into managing someone else's internal state. The sentence ends without an unspoken demand, so now fix it. And that absence of demand is what makes the message land. Pursuit often hides behind honesty. It sounds like vulnerability, but it feels like insistence. It shows up as repeated check-ins, emotional updates, and processing that never quite resolves. To the avoidant nervous system, this feels like being slowly backed into a corner. Even if the words are gentle, the pressure is cumulative. High-value energy doesn't do that. It trusts that truth, once spoken, doesn't need to be chased. The most powerful line an avoidant can hear is not a plea or a promise. It's restraint. It's someone who can name their desire without attaching their worth to whether it's reciprocated. You don't owe me alignment is not indifference. It's self-respect. It communicates, I want you, but I will not contort myself to keep you. That balance is rare, and rarity is what holds an avoidant's attention. This lack of pressure creates safety because it preserves autonomy. Avoidants attach when they don't feel trapped by someone else's needs, when they sense that disagreement won't escalate into emotional consequence, when they know they're free to choose, not coerced by someone else's vulnerability. Safety for them is not about being understood, it's about being unburdened. And ironically, this is what allows them to move closer. When clarity doesn't come with pursuit, they don't have to pull away to protect themselves. They can stay present, they can reflect, they can feel on their own timeline. Emotional clarity without pursuit doesn't demand attachment. It makes room for it. High-value partners don't chase emotional resolution. They offer truth and let it stand. And for an avoidant, that quiet confidence is not just respectful, it's irresistible. The most attractive boundary is the one that doesn't explain itself. Avoidants don't experience explanations as reassurance. They experience them as leverage. The moment a boundary comes with a paragraph, a justification, or an emotional backstory, it stops feeling like a boundary and starts feeling like a negotiation. And negotiations trigger resistance. Not because avoidants want to cross lines, but because they're highly sensitive to anything that threatens their autonomy. High-value partners understand this instinctively. They don't over-clarify their standards in hopes of being understood. They don't soften their limits to keep the peace. They don't frame boundaries as requests waiting for approval. They state them once and then they act in alignment. There's no emotional defense, no convincing, no argument disguised as explanation. This is where many people lose their power without realizing it. They believe that if they explain their boundary well enough, it will be respected. But to an avoidant, explanation signals uncertainty. It suggests that the boundary might be flexible under enough emotional pressure. High-value energy does the opposite. It communicates certainty without force. This is where I stand. No push, no pull, just presence. Avoidants are accustomed to power struggles that are disguised as communication. They've learned to read emotional discussions for hidden agendas. When someone doesn't defend their boundary, it disrupts that pattern. There's nothing to push against. Nothing to debate, nothing to win. And that absence of friction creates an unexpected sense of respect. They're not being managed or corrected. They're being trusted to respond as they choose. This is what quiet finality looks like. You don't threaten consequences. You don't announce ultimatums. You simply let your actions speak. If a standard isn't met, you adjust your proximity. If a line is crossed, you remove access. There's no emotional escalation, because the boundary was never about control. It was about self-respect. For avoidance, this is disarming. They're used to boundaries that are really attempts at closeness, rules meant to pull them in tighter. A clean boundary does the opposite. It leaves their freedom intact. And freedom is what allows them to stay. When they don't feel boxed in, they don't need to escape. The paradox is this: boundaries that don't need defense feel safer than boundaries that demand agreement. They say, I'm not here to change you. That message matters to someone who has spent their life resisting being shaped by others' expectations. It tells them they are respected as an autonomous adult, not managed like a problem to fix. And that respect changes the dynamic. Avoidants don't feel controlled. They feel seen. They don't feel pressured. They feel free. And in that freedom, something unexpected happens. They lean in, not because they were convinced, but because the space was held without force. They test with distance. High value responds with stability. Avoidants don't always pull back because they're losing interest. Often they pull back to regulate. Distance is how they regain a sense of internal control when closeness starts to feel overwhelming. And whether consciously or not, they'll act closely during this moment. Not to see if you care, but to see how you hold yourself when access is loose. This is where most dynamics are decided. When an avoidant creates space, many people react reflexively. They spiral internally. They over-communicate in hopes of restoring equilibrium. They ask clarifying questions, send emotional check-ins, or subtly try to resecure the bond. To them, it feels like care. To the avoidant nervous system, it feels like pressure. Even if the tone is gentle, high-value partners don't collapse into the gap. They don't interpret distance as abandonment or a problem that must be solved immediately. They remain steady, not cold, not punitive, just grounded, present when invited, whole when alone. That steadiness is not accidental. It comes from having an internal anchor that doesn't rely on someone else's availability. Avoidants are exquisitely sensitive to emotional reactivity. When they see someone unravel during distance, it confirms their deepest fear that closeness creates responsibility for another person's emotional state. Stability, on the other hand, communicates the opposite. It says, you can take space without causing damage, and that message relaxes the avoidant more than any reassurance ever could. This doesn't mean disappearing or withholding affection to provoke pursuit. That's strategy, and avoidants feel strategy as manipulation. Stability is different. Stability looks like continuing your life, keeping your tone consistent, responding when reached out to without resentment or urgency. There's no silent protest, no emotional withholding. just continuity. What many people don't realize is that avoidants often respect what they don't fully understand. When someone remains regulated during distance, it challenges their internal narrative that closeness equals chaos. It introduces a new experience, connection, that doesn't demand constant maintenance, and that experience is quietly powerful. Distance, in this context, becomes a test, not of loyalty, but of emotional maturity. Can you tolerate uncertainty without escalating it? Can you hold space without filling it? Can you trust yourself even when access is reduced? High-value partners answer yes, not verbally, but behaviorally. And here's the paradox. Stability during distance is not read as indifference. Avoidance can tell the difference. Indifference feels flat, disconnected, and emotionally absent. Stability feels warm, consistent, and intact. One pushes them away, the other invites them back on their own terms. When an avoidant returns and finds the connection unchanged, not tighter, not looser, just steady, it leaves an impression. It tells them the bond doesn't require panic to survive. And for someone who has spent a lifetime managing emotional intensity, that kind of stability doesn't go unnoticed. Nothing lowers your value faster than making love feel like alone. Avoidants don't pull away because they don't care. They pull away because they sense obligation forming. The moment affection, effort, or presence starts to feel transactional, their nervous system registers danger. Love that comes with an elevator, even a subtle one, feels heavy. And heaviness is exactly what avoidants are trying to escape. Emotional debt doesn't always look obvious. It shows up in tone, in timing, in the way something is later referenced. A comment like, "after everything I've done," or "I was there for you when," might seem reasonable, but to an avoidant, it lands as a bill being slid across the table. Even if repayment isn't demanded outright, the implication is there. And once obligation enters the connection, freedom exits. High-value partners don't operate this way. They don't keep score of who showed up more, who gave more, who waited longer. They don't imply sacrifice to secure appreciation. They don't remind someone of their effort to earn commitment. Their giving is clean. If they offer something, it's because they genuinely want to, not because they're investing for a future return. This is deeply regulating for an avoidant. When there's no emotional debt, there's no fear of disappointing someone by being human, then no fear of being behind in the relationship. No pressure to repay care with availability. The connection remains breathable because it isn't weighted down by unspoken expectations. Many people unintentionally create debt by overgiving. They give more than feels sustainable, then wait for the other person to notice and reciprocate. Avoidants feel that imbalance instantly, and rather than stepping up, they often step back, not out of cruelty, but self-protection. High-value partners don't overextend. They match their giving to what feels aligned, not to what they hope will be earned. This doesn't mean withholding affection or playing hard to get. It means discernment. It means asking yourself, if this is never returned, would I still choose to give it? If the answer is no, it's not a gift. It's leverage, and avoidance sense leverage as control. When someone gives freely without tracking, something shifts. The avoidant no longer feels like they're accruing a silent obligation. They can receive without anxiety. They can enjoy closeness without calculating the future cost. And that relief opens the door to genuine attachment. Ironically, the absence of debt often invites reciprocity. When love doesn't feel like a loan, it becomes something they want to return, not something they feel forced to repay. High-value partners don't chase balance. They create freedom. And in that freedom, connection has room to grow without suffocating under the weight of obligation. Avoidants never forget the ones who leave without punishment. The most misunderstood power move in an avoidant dynamic is walking away without anger, not storming out, not issuing ultimatums, not delivering a final speech designed to finally be understood, just leaving cleanly, calmly, with dignity intact. This is the moment that carries more weight than months of conversations ever could, because it breaks the pattern avoidance. Avoidants are accustomed to exits that come with emotional consequences. When people leave, they usually take something with them: blame, resentment, guilt, or a demand to be chased. Even silence is often weaponized. Those exits reinforce the avoidant's belief that closeness inevitably turns into emotional warfare. so they brace for impact long before it happens. A clean exit disorients them. The highest value move is not staying longer to prove loyalty. It's recognizing when alignment isn't there and responding without punishment. No ultimatums designed to force commitment. No emotional retaliation meant to finally make them feel something. No attempt to secure a place in their memory through intensity. Just self-respect in motion. This kind of departure does something profound. It removes the avoidance usual defense mechanisms. There's nothing to argue against, no accusation to deflect, no emotional chaos to justify withdrawal. The absence of attack creates space for awareness, and awareness is uncomfortable for avoidance because it requires self-reflection rather than escape. When you leave without anger, you don't confirm their fear that intimacy leads to emotional debt. You don't validate their narrative that people want too much from them. Instead, you present a new experience, someone who wanted connection, named it honestly, and chose themselves when it wasn't available. That combination is rare, and rarity is what lingers. Avoidance may not chase you in that moment. They may not even react outwardly, but internally, something shifts. Clean exits plant questions they can't easily dismiss. Why didn't this person fight? Why wasn't I punished? Why do I feel this now? Instead of relief. That delayed impact is what makes these exits unforgettable. This isn't about being remembered, it's about integrity. When you leave without anger, you demonstrate that your worth isn't contingent on being chosen. You don't try to control their growth or force a reckoning. You simply remove yourself from a dynamic that requires self-abandonment. And that quiet self-respect is what avoidants feel long after the connection ends. Avoidants confuse intensity with danger and safety with boredom. Avoidants often mistake chaos for chemistry and calm for disinterest. Intensity lights up their nervous system, but it also activates their fear. Emotional highs come with emotional costs. And avoidants learn early that excitement often precedes loss of control. So they oscillate, drawn to chemistry, then retreating from the vulnerability it creates. High-value partners don't bond through chaos. They don't confuse sparks with sustainability. They don't rely on push-pull dynamics, emotional volatility, or dramatic highs to create connection. Instead, they build something quieter and far more destabilizing to an avoidance defenses: consistency. Consistency doesn't spike adrenaline, it grounds. And grounding is exactly what allows avoidance to attach without feeling like they're losing themselves. This is where many connections fail. People try to keep avoidance engaged by amplifying intensity, being more intriguing, more emotionally expressive, more unpredictable. But intensity reinforces the avoidance belief that closeness equals danger. High-value partners do the opposite. They remain steady, predictable in presence, clear in intention, unmoved by emotional theatrics. Grounding feels unfamiliar to avoidance at first. It can even register as boredom because their nervous system is used to scanning for threat. But over time, something changes. The absence of chaos creates a new internal experience: safety without suffocation, connection without cost. And that's when real attachment becomes possible. High-value partners don't rush intimacy. They let trust accumulate naturally. They don't demand constant emotional engagement to feel secure. Their consistency is not performative, it's lived. And that lived steadiness slowly retrains the avoidant nervous system to associate closeness with calm rather than confinement. This doesn't mean the connection lacks depth. It means depth isn't built through emotional spikes. It's built through reliability, through showing up the same way on good days and quiet days, through presence that doesn't disappear when things feel ordinary. Avoidants attach when they realize they can stay connected without losing autonomy, when they can be close without being consumed, when chemistry doesn't threaten their sense of self. Grounding provides that environment. It allows them to choose connection rather than react in intensity. In the end, high value in an avoidant dynamic isn't about being unforgettable through drama. It's about being irreplaceable through stability, leaving without anger, choosing connection over chaos, staying whole, whether chosen or not. Those are the experiences that bypass avoidance and quietly change what love feels like. They attach when they realize you didn't shrink to keep them. Avoidants may never articulate this out loud, but they feel it deeply. Respect forms when someone remains intact in their presence. Not performatively strong, not emotionally armored, Just avoidants are highly attuned to self-abandonment because they've spent much of their lives avoiding the cost of emotional enmeshment. When they sense someone reshaping themselves to maintain connection, it activates distrust rather than closeness. Contorting for connection looks subtle at first. It's saying yes when you mean maybe, being more available than feels natural, softening your needs to keep the peace, waiting longer than you should without naming what you want. None of this looks dramatic, but avoidants feel the internal imbalance immediately. And instead of feeling chosen, they feel responsible. Responsibility is where desire goes to die for an avoidant. High-value partners don't shrink to be palatable. They don't inflate their emotions to hold attention or minimize themselves to avoid conflict. There's no self-erasure, no over-availability disguised as flexibility, no emotional inflation designed to feel indispensable. They stay proportionate to themselves. Their wants don't get louder to be heard, and they don't disappear when unmet. This grounded presence is deeply unsettling to an avoidance expectations. They are used to people, bending, adjusting, trying. When someone doesn't, it interrupts the power dynamic. The avoidant realizes, often too late, that this person wasn't anchored by the connection. They were anchored by themselves, and that realization is what creates attachment, not anxiety. Avoidants respect people who don't chase them into closeness. When you remain intact during uncertainty, it communicates something powerful. I want you, but I don't need to become someone else to keep you. That message is not received as indifference. It's received as strength. And strength, when it isn't wielded against them, feels safe. This doesn't mean withholding affection or playing it cool. It means emotional congruence. You show up as you are, interested, present, honest, without negotiating your identity for reassurance. You don't abandon your routines, values, or sense of self to accommodate their inconsistency. And when alignment isn't there, you don't collapse. You adjust your proximity, not your worth. Avoidants attach when they see that someone didn't lose themselves in the dynamic, that the connection didn't cost the person their center. This realization often arrives after distance or loss, when they reflect on what felt different, what felt steady, what didn't demand, and what didn't disappear inside them. High value isn't who stays the longest, it's who stays whole. Avoidants don't fall for those who convince them with effort, patience, or emotional endurance. They don't attach because someone waited longer, loved harder, or explained better. They attach when they encounter someone who refuses to abandon themselves to be chosen. This truth is uncomfortable because it dismantles the idea that love is earned through sacrifice. In avoidant dynamics, sacrifice is often read as pressure. High value isn't persistence, it's presence without self-betrayal. It's the ability to offer connection without turning it into a referendum on your worth. Staying whole means you don't make someone else's readiness the center of your life. You don't pause your growth, your joy, or your direction in anticipation of being picked. You allow the connection to exist, but not at the expense of yourself. And that posture changes the entire dynamic. Avoidance may not feel safe with this immediately. In fact, it can trigger discomfort because someone who stays whole can't be controlled through distance, ambiguity, or delayed commitment. They don't chase clarity to soothe anxiety. They don't tolerate misalignment in the name of potential. Their stability isn't contingent on being chosen. And eventually, sometimes only in hindsight, avoidants recognize what that stability represented. Not pressure, not demand, but real safety. The kind of safety that doesn't ask them to perform or flee. The kind that exists whether they step forward or not. High-value people aren't unforgettable because they stayed through uncertainty. They're unforgettable because they didn't disappear inside it. They didn't shrink. They didn't harden. They didn't contort themselves into something more acceptable. They stayed whole. And for someone who equates closeness with loss of self, witnessing that wholeness quietly redefines what love can be.